Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
Oaktober's finally here.
I felt like we should do that in like a ghoul voice or something for Halloween.
Oaktober. I don't think that cut it.
Oaktober. Yeah.
Oaktober, tober. I always think of the announcer for, like, you know, when they have the local radio station ads for, like, the monster trucks are coming to town. You know what I'm saying? It's always in that really aggressive tone of voice.
Yeah. For some reason, I thought of the way that they introduce boxing fights, you know, that famous way.
Yeah.
Let's get ready for Oaktober.
Yeah. That was close, Marcus.
Oh, man.
Well, I don't have to worry about, you know, any football games that are happening in October, so.
You got one to worry about.
So I can just
the race for the worst.
So I can just focus on hunting, man.
I know.
I'm good with it. I don't have to worry about skipping games.
Man, I got some opportunities coming up, you know, to get in the woods. So I'm pretty excited.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to get out, I think, this weekend if I can. Bow hunt a little bit.
Nice. Yep. Mine are not bow hunting. Mine were dove hunting. So
yeah, I might do that Friday too,
nice.
Hopefully. So I hadn't shot at a bird yet, which is disappointing.
Yeah, it's not open here yet when we're recording.
Yeah, which is funny because a lot of states have a southern zone that opens before the northern zone, and Florida doesn't open till after the northern zone in most states that are further north.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on with that, but I was kind of taken by it because I thought it was just what you did on you know, the first weekend of September.
Yeah, it always has been. Maybe we need dove science.
Hey now.
And we could have a season date discussion on there.
Yeah. Well, interesting that you bring that up. We did just recently add another couple of folks to the podcast network.
I heard. I talked to one of them last week.
Oh, really?
Yeah. James Callicutt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
I ran into him.
Yeah, I'm excited about that.
Yeah.
So what do they call on their podcast? Game?
Was it just Game Birds? Game Bird?
Yeah, I think it's Game Bird University.
Okay.
So, but it'll be in the Natural Resources University network. So folks that are interested in that, you know, I definitely encourage you to go check it out. James is really an expert on waterfowl in particular. At least that's what I know him as.
But he knows a lot about all kinds of birds.
Yeah, no doubt. And you know, we've had the other one on our show before. Mm-hmm. So he's you know, really a specialist on quail, although he does a little bit of work with turkeys. He doesn't like to admit that, though.
Yeah. Yeah. He does not like to admit that. Like anytime turkey topics come up and, you know, he'll spout off, you know, some obscure fact about turkeys and then he'll be like, but I'm not a turkey scientist. Y'all are. No. I'm like, yeah, well, you just spouted off something I didn't know, so.
He's just a smart dude is what he is.
Yeah, he is.
So, I think
he retains everything.
Yeah. I think their show has strong potential.
Yep.
So I'm
absolutely. Are we going to let them talk about turkeys? Are you going to let them talk about turkeys? You're the head of that network, aren't you?
Well, I don't know if I'm the head of the network, but our shop is doing the processing for the network.
Mhm.
So we don't actually have any influence over what people are talking about on their own shows, though.
Right.
So I don't know what they're going to talk about.
Well, and I think that's the way to do it too, you get
Yeah,
people in there that you trust and know they know their stuff and let them go.
yeah. Well, James and Mark are both competent scientists.
Mhm.
They they should develop content and deliver it as they see fit. And I don't want to influence that. And sometimes they might conflict with what in terms of uh, they might cover turkey stuff, and I encourage them to do so. And they might also conflict with us on what their thoughts are on turkey stuff
That's fine.
compared to ours, and that's fine too.
Yeah, as long as the conversation is ongoing, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, I agree.
So how are we gonna crack this nut today?
I see what you did there.
Yeah.
I've heard of folks actually making like acorn flour and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I would be really curious if one of our listeners out there, has done something like that. Reach out and share that with us. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I wonder how it tastes. I wonder what species would be best for it.
Yeah, I have eaten it before, and I
I'm
can't
inclined to say it
remember.
would have to be a white oak species, right?
Well, you can process the tannins out of it, and I think that's necessary. But it may be,
Do you like soak them to get the tannins out or something?
yeah, like boiling it.
Yeah.
So I don't know if the process changes. I assume that it probably does based on the species that you're doing it with. But
Yeah.
yeah, apparently that it's got a long history, even back to Native Americans using it. So yeah, we wanted to start off Oaktober with more of a general overlook of oaks,
Mhm.
just about their biology. We did something similar last year, but a lot of research has come out since then,
Yeah.
and we also didn't cover everything there is to know about it.
No. It's
So
impossible to do that.
yeah, well, we can link that one, so folks can go back to that if you didn't get a chance to listen to it. But also, I think we'll have a lot of different conversation this time,
Yeah.
especially since I don't remember the conversation then.
Nor do I.
I know that we tried to give
Every day I wake up is a new day, Marcus.
yeah, we tried to give an overview. I do remember that,
Yeah.
but I don't remember exactly what we covered in it. But I think we should do that again. It was
Yeah.
a popular episode. I think people really are interested and fascinated.
So, if you're gonna have a conversation on acorn, let's call it oaks or acorns 101, acorns.
Acres
Maybe that's where we
101.
should start is how to pronounce it. Um, what's the first thing you need to talk about, or the first thing that people need to understand about oaks?
Well, I
And I'm asking that
are
as
you
much of myself as I am of you,
are you
because
talking of let's give a little more context. Who are we talking to? Are you talking about our audience?
yeah,
I think the first thing that people gravitate to is that mast is a really abundant food source in the
hmm
fall
yeah,
and winter for species that we care about, like
yeah,
wild turkeys, white-tailed deer. Some folks care about other stuff like squirrels or whatever, and that usually is the primer, I would say, for
hmm
people getting interested in oaks,
yeah,
especially from a wildlife management standpoint.
yeah. So they're generally abundant across the landscape. There's
Yeah.
it's hard to it's hard to find an animal that doesn't have one oak tree doesn't have any oak trees in its home range unless you're somewhere out in a grassland area or prairie.
Mhm.
Um, and
But
they represent
even in that case, there are oaks that do really well in that context.
true. That's a good point
So,
too. And
yeah.
drainages and things like that. I mean, we spent some time in one of those places last year about this time in Nebraska when they
Mhm.
had there was a lot of prairie out there, but and a lot of pasture, but then they had these drains that had bur oak in them
Mhm.
too. So, but yeah, when I think of acorns, in wildlife, I just think, it's a energy-rich food source, starting in fall when animals need to deposit body fat. And so, a food item that's relatively high in carbohydrates and fats helps
Hmm.
accomplish that objective. And then it can serve as a continual food source throughout the winter to help them maintain that body condition. And that's something that we've talked about a lot on this particular podcast within the context of turkeys is we think that it's probably important, or at least logically you would think it's important, especially for not just hens, but hens a little bit more so than gobblers to go into the beginning of next year as they're preparing, to start egg laying in the best possible body condition that they can be in. And
Hmm.
so acorns can help achieve that objective.
Yeah, I think we do have a couple of papers that we've covered a few
Hmm.
times now that show hens in better body condition tend to perform better during the reproductive seasons.
I know they nested earlier, and then what was the other metric that
I think they had
responded to
a
that?
that I think there was a higher initiation rate
Uh huh.
and uh, a higher success rate,
Yeah, I think
hatching
it
success.
was. Yeah,
So, but that was split between two publications.
that's right.
So, uh, but yeah, so we do have some evidence that body condition's important, and we know that turkeys are using this resource, so it stands to reason. Reason we're kind of dancing around this topic is I have not seen a direct test of that hypothesis
Right.
where we show that hens typically come out in better condition when we have big mast ears.
Yeah. Yeah, and
But
and I mean, I think there's not. It would be hard to argue that a hen that was starving throughout fall and winter would perform, as good as one that had abundant food resources. But the difficulty of disentangling this is, of course, there's all sorts of other things out there that turkeys
mhm,
eat. Even though acorns can be a really important food item that dominates,
right.
their diet during that time of the year.
I think the conversation we're having right now is what irritates some people.
You're thinking of that YouTube comment that we were discussing earlier, aren't you?
Yeah, well, I mean, we
Or
get plenty of those kind that, uh, we won't just be definitive
yeah,
on some things, and you know, that's our role.
we're
We're
beating
supposed to
around the
be
we're beating around the oak tree.
the oak bush. Yeah. So I think if you kind of pull the veil off of oak ecology, there's a lot of other really cool things going on.
Mhm.
And I think it's fun to explore that. And I have done that to great extents because it started during graduate school in my master's, where I was working on the white oak study with Craig Harper,
Mhm.
and I've always had an interest because I've always been a deer hunter and a turkey hunter,
Right.
right? So I cared about oaks because of that,
Yeah.
and I think that a lot of people probably can relate to that. But then I started getting some formal experience from a scientific standpoint when I got into my master's program, and that has continued on all the way till now. I have a current uh, 8 year long project. We're in the fourth year now, the fourth masting season.
Mhm.
So, I've actively been working on this personally for decades now.
Yeah, and that topic is gonna have its own breakout episode in this series during the
Yeah,
month
we're
of
covering some
October.
of the new stuff coming out of that
Yeah,
study. Yeah.
and that's an episode in particular that I'm excited about because I think I'm going to learn a lot from it because most of the oak masting work that I'm familiar with has been done kind of in the mid South and then up through the Appalachians.
Hmm.
So there's a number of species that many of us would be interested in knowing more about that occur you know, in the deep South, and in the coastal plain in particular, that we really don't have a lot of good information about. And I think your study is going to
Yeah.
address some of that.
Well, I think that's true. We have almost no information on a few of the species we're studying,
Right.
but there's also some other interesting aspects of the study that there's no other published information on. For example, we've had technicians out there checking hundreds of trees, these baskets that we put under it every week.
Yeah.
And so we have a very fine resolution of when acorns are falling by individual tree over a long term.
Yeah,
so
that's going to be really cool.
Yeah.
See, like, I'm already wanting to ask you questions about that, but I'm having to restrain myself. Like, what is the annual variation by species and all that,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're gonna get to that. But I thought it would be interesting for us to talk about some other things. One thing, we keep saying the word masting.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what that means?
So yes and no.
I'm putting you on the spot.
I'm vaguely familiar with it. I do know that, people, the whoever those people are that determine what a masting species is or isn't. I've heard some people try to say that oaks are not a true masting species. But most people, obviously, and we're using the term mast over and over today, consider them a masting species. But does it not have to do something with the synchrony of production of seed?
Yeah. So there's masting is, well, first of all, you have a mast year. That would be the year that there's an abundance of seed production across individuals. And it can be across species, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But basically, what a mast year is when you're on for the synchrony.
Right.
So there's two really critical elements for mast seeding. You have that synchrony within a year, but it also is that synchrony doesn't happen every year.
Okay.
So you have this high variability across years. So you have on years and off years. So you have a mast year and non-mast year.
Yeah.
But they're synchronized in that variability.
Yeah.
If that makes
I wonder
sense.
if that's where some of the debate comes from as to whether or not they're a true masting species, whatever that is because, there are certain species that have some kind of, low baseline level of production almost every year.
Yeah, but that would still be a non-mast year.
Yeah.
The mast year is really when there's a boom and, there's a high effort for flowering that was successful. Some of that also may stem from the red oak subgenus.
Yeah.
That they are taking 2 years to develop fully. So you have a flower, you go through one growing season through the winter, and that whole time the flower that was pollinated is growing into an acorn and maturing.
Right.
And then it would go through a second growing season, and then fall that fall.
Right. And so to be clear on this, because some folks get confused about it, red oaks are capable of producing acorns every year.
Yeah,
it's
same
just the
individual.
timeline from flower to seed production is 2 years as opposed to the white oak subgenus where it's 1 or less than a year.
Yeah, so what typically happens, at least from my understanding with red oak species, is when they have a really big flowering year, they have, tons of acorns that are in development on it. So even though they can flower again in the following year, there's not as many places to flower from, and they don't invest in it as much.
That makes sense.
So you could have that same sort of alternating where the individual might produce some acorns every year, but it typically has a big year and little years dispersed within that.
I mean, if you look at the figures, from these various long-term studies, you can definitely see that, there's years where it's, production, even if it produces at a low level every year, there are many species that will, in their true masting year, produce 10x what it was, or maybe even more in that low production year.
It's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And in particular, if you line up several years of non-mast years, when you finally hit that year when they all synchronize, then that's what we would have like as a bumper crop year.
Yeah.
So with white oak, they can produce every year, and that's only one one cycle. So basically flowering, it matures over the summer into the fall and then falls that same
Mhm.
fall. Um, but you tend to see that same sort of pattern where you have on years and off years,
Mhm.
even though the white oak could do it every year, and it's not that necessarily detrimental to it from a resource standpoint.
Mhm.
It still has this alternating pattern where you have on years, and it doesn't necessarily have to be every other year. That we'll talk about that in a minute. What's actually causing synchrony?
Yeah.
But you tend to see that same pattern where you might go a few years without much mast, and then all of a sudden they all synchronize and
Mhm.
everybody has mast.
Yeah, and the other cool thing that you can see from some of those figures that I alluded to earlier is that oftentimes it works out that species that belong in one of those subgenera, so the white oak or the red oak subgenus, um, oftentimes within a subgenus, like you'll see many of the species of reds producing one year, and then the next year it might be the whites,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then that's a poor production year for the reds, which I think speaks to the importance of having a diversity. And I think a lot of us as hunters always want to know what's the best, right? Like
Right.
what is the best
Let's
tree,
get all the best
yeah,
one in there,
for
and
me to plant, or what's the best tree species for me to release, for turkeys,
yeah.
and
Or
things
they
like
may be
that.
going in and thinning out species they don't like,
Right,
to favor, maybe you're going in and thinning down to a low basal area and you're retaining all the white oak and leaving all the red oak,
right,
on the hit list for removal.
yeah. I wouldn't do that.
I wouldn't either.
For that simple reason that the reds tend to do good in certain years and the whites tend to do good in certain years, and so you want both. And then there's also other aspects like the secondary plant compounds and stuff like that that they have, affects their timing of use. They got different timing of drop. I'm sure
Hmm.
we'll go into all that kind of thing, more detail in all those various topics. But yeah, many reasons to have
Yeah.
diversity.
So let's talk about what is actually causing synchrony. So, and I'm talking about there's a proximate cause that I think is really well established now.
Hmm.
And then there's like an ultimate cause that we think is a reason why this pattern wouldn't be so important to oaks.
Hmm.
So the proximate cause, essentially, what's happening is the oaks in a population are investing in flowering during the spring
Hmm.
or early summer, and you hit a suite of weather conditions
Hmm.
during flowering that are either really good for flowering or really poor. And you can imagine locally, within a local population, they're all experiencing pretty similar conditions, right?
Right.
So, what we would call that, or what the technical term is, I guess, in the literature for that hypothesis that I'm kind of laying out here, is called environmental veto hypothesis.
Environmental veto.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, essentially, when the conditions are good for flowering and pollination during that time,
Mhm.
everybody does it.
Yeah.
And they're really successful. So you get a
Mhm.
lot of mass produced because of that,
Right.
as opposed to a poor conditions, or maybe you have a late frost, or
Mhm.
lots of things could happen that promote poor conditions, and everybody's exposed to that, and you basically have a failure
Mhm.
from that.
So you just made me think about something that I've never thought about before,
Well,
and
that's good.
which happens often, and it may come off as completely off the wall, and if so, that's okay. But
I think that's why some people are listening, Will.
maybe so.
You never know what's coming on the show.
But oaks flower relatively early in spring,
Hmm.
right?
Some
Um,
some do.
well, there's variation by species,
Yeah.
of course, but a lot of the ones that are kind of the staple oaks that we typically think of, like white oak and northern red oak, for example, um, I've always thought of that as, like, you've heard me use this terminology before. Is it a feature or a bug, right?
Hmm.
I've always thought of that as a bug, like something that is inherently wrong with their biology. But now that you talked about this environmental veto topic, it's got me wondering, is that a feature? So could the
I would
fact
say almost certainly it's a feature.
right, so yeah, so could the fact that they flower early, help them, or could it play into them masting when conditions are more ideal, or could it play into helping them conserve resources in certain years so that they can mast in others? See what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's where some of the debate is with this whole uh, this whole topic area.
Mm-hmm.
And to be clear for folks out there, we're probably talking about, I would say, a couple hundred papers a year globally being published on this topic.
Yeah.
They're not all on oak.
Right.
Okay, so that's one thing I want to make clear. It is a common phenomenon in perennial plants. Actually, there's a paper on this from Bojkowicz. I don't know how to say his name, but he's published like over 100 papers on this topic all over the world. He's one of the people that's kind of leading the conversation on this, I would say. But he had a recent paper showing that plants that are investing strongly in long-lived tissue.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, like a tree, they're
Yeah.
investing in wood and bark.
Right.
That this is a feature that commonly is associated with those kinds of species. So a plant that's investing a lot in long-lived tissue tends to be stronger in mass seeding,
Mm-hmm.
and that could be oaks or beeches or lots of different species all over the planet.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what the meta-analysis trying to look at that, like trying to explain it across plants in general.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that closely associates with it.
So probably the longer lived species are going to be more likely to mast, in other words.
Yeah, they tend to be mass eating, and it tends to be more extreme, where you have bigger ups and downs and tighter synchrony.
That's funny because I oftentimes think a lot about, when we're talking about understory management, I think about, a lot of annual plants invest a lot of resources into seed. Um,
Yeah,
but this is like on the opposite of the spectrum, very long-lived plants doing the same thing.
yeah, and technically, the annual plants would not be mass seeding.
Right. Right, because
Yeah,
they do it every year, right?
right. And you may see a similar pattern, but it's a different individual every
Yeah.
time.
I guess that's the point is like an annual plant can afford to invest so much in seed because that's the only reproductive opportunity that it ever gets.
Yeah,
Whereas if you're a longer lived species, you should probably be more strategic about how you do that.
right. And in fact, species that are in the same genus in a genus that has annual and perennial, you do see that. You see per capita less investment in roots, so you have a higher shoot to root ratio in the annual,
Mm-hmm.
and you also have a much higher investment in seed production in the annual versus the perennial
Yeah.
even though they're closely related.
Right. Really interesting.
Yeah. So um, another thing that I actually mentioned it to you earlier before the show because I was trying to remember exactly what it meant before we got on the air.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a phenomenon that's called the Moran effect,
Yeah.
and the current consensus on this is basically that you get this environmental entrainment basically in populations.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean is that environmental veto is pretty much affecting everybody in the local area very
Mm-hmm.
similarly. And, like if you have other stressors like drought or something that might also stimulate, multiple years of stress on the individual, we often see, that bumper crop come after that when, they weren't able to synchronize for a while. The Moran effect is sort of looking at this process across space, right? And what we see is within these relatively local areas, maybe a few county area, we see this high degree of synchronization across all the individuals in those populations. But that synchrony starts to break down as you get farther and farther away, which
Sure.
makes sense if it's related to the environment. That can change, and maybe there's a drought in this state, but in the one over, there's not, right? So things like that are definitely playing into this. But it's kind of an interesting thing to think through because there are some features of this that probably are playing a really important role. And I know that we're kind of, it seems like a sidebar for things like turkeys and deer that a lot of our listeners are thinking about, but it ultimately makes a difference to them.
Yeah.
Because it's affecting when there's food available and how much they get to access versus compete with the others. So there's pretty strong evidence. There's actually a recent paper, it just came out, which, by the way, I have 3 papers that I'm going to get linked in here for people that are a really good overview of this. This Botchkowitz guy.
Was said with so much respect.
Do what?
I said that was a really respectful way of putting it.
What's that?
This Botchkowitz guy.
Yeah. He's the lead author on one of them that was in Ecology Letters. That's a really big journal that's rigorous. So it's called Mechanisms Driving Interspecific Variation and Regional Synchrony of Tree Reproduction.
Got it.
That Moran effect that I just talked about, that's basically, this is how does the Moran effect work?
Yeah.
That could have also been the title.
I like that title better.
But he also was an author, but this guy we're gonna call it.
If y'all aren't watching on YouTube, I'm already cracking up. But Marcus looks like a confused puppy right now, trying to.
I'm gonna call his name Zemkowiak.
Okay.
Let's see what you think. SZY.
I gotta write this down.
SZYMKOWIAK. It's clearly Zemkowiak.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's how I would have said it. Zemkowiak.
Yeah. So Zemkowiak et al.
The S is silent.
Yeah. Okay. Zemkowiak et al. 2024. This is in the Oaktober issue.
Nice.
So it's literally like while we're recording, it's getting put in the issue that's going to be in Oaktober.
Zemkowiak knows about some Oaktober too.
Yeah. See, they were trying to do it, and the Botchkowitz, Michael Botchkowitz is on there, and another name that I see all the time in this literature base that has definitely been really influential is Michael Steele, who's in the United States, I believe. The other guys are European. Anyway, they were looking at some potential ultimate mechanisms. So let's talk about that just briefly, real quick. What is approximate versus ultimate? So the proximate mechanism, we talked about, is this environmental veto, right? So when all the conditions are good, everybody can invest successfully, and when environmental conditions are bad, so that's a proximate cue that is some stimuli in the environment that is ultimately flipping the switch on or off, right?
So you might think about like precipitation.
Yeah, could be. Like in Texas, when we're talking about the proximate cue of really high quality brooding cover being available as it rained. Right? So in this case with oaks, the leading hypothesis is this idea that it's a predator satiation mechanism. So let's talk about what does that mean. essentially what we mean is that when the oaks synchronize, that mast is so abundant that it overwhelms the predators of those seeds.
Mm-hmm.
They can't process them fast enough, so some of the seeds make it through and germinate.
It's the same kind of thing that probably a lot of our listeners have heard referenced in term, relative to, you know, turkey reproductive timing or deer,
Yeah.
synchrony and reproduction. The
Hmm.
idea is if you put, so much food on the landscape at once, some of it's going to survive. In this
Yeah.
case, we're just talking about seeds.
Yep. And that there are some parallels there, although that's technically a different hypothesis.
I
But
was
it's
trying
the
to make an
same principle.
analogy.
It's the same
I
principle.
know. Yeah.
Here's why it's different though. With oaks or mass seeding in general, the idea is that you have synchrony sometimes, and sometimes you have a complete failure,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the reason that's important, you think about, oh, we've got this bug that specializes on acorns, and when they're abundant, it does awesome, right? And you
Yeah.
have this huge reproductive event from that seed predator, and then next year there's a mast failure, and that population completely fails
Yeah.
because the food source is not present.
Yeah. It's like the oaks are saying, don't get too comfortable.
Right. So they're, sort of like chasing each other, right? Where the
Yeah.
oak says, okay, we're going to have a few years of failure to get rid of all these seed predators, and then boom, we're going to try to overwhelm them. So this that
Mm-hmm.
strategy where you have this emergence of a boom bust cycle that essentially keeps the oak out ahead of the seed predator.
Yeah. It seems like that strategy would be really important for a plant or an animal that had a a pest that was specialized in affecting it. Because for example, if if the pest was a species that if acorns aren't abundant, maybe they switch over to hickories, right? Then the failure really wouldn't affect their population as much.
That's right. That actually is one of the big problems. That hypothesis is focused pretty much completely on specialist
Yeah,
insects,
yeah,
which they are,
like the acorn weevil, or
yeah,
yeah,
which there's lots of species of those. Uh, but that it works really well for that. But it doesn't work really well for basically all of the facultative seed predators,
mm-hmm,
which is what you were talking about. So things that eat seeds when they're abundant, or the acorns when they're abundant, but they also eat a bunch of other stuff, and if they'll just switch to something else.
for example, wild turkeys.
Yeah,
They're a facultative seed predator.
yeah. Wouldn't it suck if every time there was a mass failure, all the turkeys died off?
Yes, it would.
Like
It
that,
would
that
suck a
wouldn't work very
lot.
well.
It would suck quite a bit, Marcus.
Yeah. So, uh, yeah. So that's a pretty stark example of where
Right.
that hypothesis starts to break down.
Yeah.
And when you're reading through this literature, people are kind of going back and forth, and they keep kind of caveating one another, and there's a lot of discussion over this,
Academic jousting.
and there's a pretty reasonable endpoint where there's probably a whole bunch of ultimate factors
Yeah.
playing in, right? It's not gonna we're not gonna explain it with one thing.
Yeah. Maybe these oak guys should start a podcast and go back and forth.
I think it'd be awesome. I would listen to it. I mean, oaks are they're a foundational genus.
Right.
Like they are structuring ecosystems.
Oh, absolutely.
So, I definitely think I get really fascinated with it because it's also there's so much complexity and so many interactions going on.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's fun, and the species that I love are really influenced by them.
Yeah.
Like
If
turkeys and
you
deer.
enjoy complicated ecology, oaks are definitely a topic worth exploring.
Yeah, a lot of fun digging around in that.
I've got an exciting announcement today from our friends at Grounded Brand. They have decided to offer a 10% discount to Wild Turkey Science listeners So if you go to groundedbrand.com, you can choose from a variety of apparel and turkey hunting gear that they have available. It's really nice looking stuff. And just enter the code Turkey Science, all one word at checkout, and you'll get 10% off.
So
we've talked about the proximate cause.
Yeah, and then the ultimate is thought to be related to this predator satiation, although there are problems with it.
Right.
Like the facultative seed predators.
Right.
The other problem with it is that oaks need to be dispersed generally.
Mm-hmm.
The acorn falls to the ground and it can germinate right there, but it's better if it gets carried somewhere else.
Sure.
Most of the time that's by an animal, like a squirrel or a corvid, blue jays and crows and things like that. But most of the time something picks the acorn up and takes it somewhere and stashes it.
Yep.
So it's called a cache, and that's best for the oak. That's the best outcome.
Right.
But those things that are doing that also eat them.
Yeah.
The reason they're stashing them, the reason the squirrel's going and stashing them somewhere is because it wants to eat them later.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So the oak wants the squirrel to go cache the acorn and then get eaten by a hawk.
Well, actually, it's pretty remarkable, that whole interaction. I've gotten fascinated with it because I didn't realize how much that happens.
Yeah.
There's also some pretty cool literature, and one of the postdocs in my lab actually has worked on an aspect of this, but the squirrels are also stealing from each other all the time. So basically, a squirrel gets an acorn, and then it's got to cache it somewhere, which is, it goes and digs a hole and buries an acorn in it.
That's why they look so twitchy and paranoid while they're burying it, because they're afraid
well, they're
somebody's
like
going to
looking
steal
around, freaking out. But the work on it has shown that what they will do is go bury it in a place that's risky.
Yeah.
So the squirrel will preferentially go put the acorn somewhere that is at high risk for another squirrel to come steal it.
Yeah.
To get predated in particular.
No way.
Yes.
The squirrels are trying to get each other killed?
Yes.
Man, that's dirty.
So
now I don't feel as bad about how many I've shot over the years.
Well, I don't know what the survival rate is typically, but it's not 100%, obviously.
Yes. I'd imagine
but you can
it's
think
pretty
about
low.
If a squirrel is there's actually, I don't have it right at my fingertips. There's an estimate of how many acorns get cached by squirrels a year.
Yeah.
If that squirrel gets killed, which is probably, let's say, 30 or 40% of the time, all the acorns that cached are now in these places that would have to be pilfered by another squirrel.
Right.
For the acorn not to just be in a good spot to germinate and grow.
Yeah.
So I think that's fascinating.
I do
the other
too.
thing that's really fascinating about it is where is risky for a squirrel to bury it? A canopy opening.
Yeah.
So they actually put them in the place that you'd want to plant the seedling.
That is so perfect.
Don't you love that?
Yeah, because oaks need a whole lot of sunlight to properly grow.
Well, and that's where it's risky for a squirrel to be. And the idea is that for the squirrel that has this memory of where it put it, it can run in and get it and get out of there, not exposing itself to risk. Yeah. But for a pilfering squirrel, it's got to spend some time hunting around for the acorn.
Squirrel. I love the name, pilfering squirrel.
Maybe that should be the title.
That sounds like a good, I don't know, I was going to say grunge band. I don't know why that's what came to mind, the Pilfering Squirrels.
Sounds like a good
Maybe
name
bluegrass.
For some podcast hosts.
Maybe bluegrass.
Yeah. I could hear that banjo right now,
The Pilfering Squirrels.
But this is why I get fascinated, because it does, like, its nature, like the perfection of all these interactions is just special.
God, if you're not fascinated by that, I I don't know what would fascinate you. I mean,
So
that is so cool that they prefer to do it out in canopy gaps.
yeah. So we're kind of honing in on another hypothesis here, and I don't recall what the name of it is precisely, but it's basically uh, we're honing in on it. Another thing that happens when you have a scarcity of acorns, what do you think the squirrel does with the ones it finds?
Hmm. Do they eat them sooner?
They usually eat them,
Yeah.
the majority of them. But when there's acorns running out of their ears,
Mm-hmm.
they go bury them everywhere.
Right.
So there actually is a behavioral response of the cacher now
Right.
to preferentially cache instead of
Yeah.
eat.
Right.
So that's called a conditional mutualist.
Mm-hmm.
So under some conditions, squirrels and oaks are mutual. They have a mutualism. They both
Right.
benefit from the interaction, but that's conditional on how much mast is available.
Right.
So in big mast years, squirrels go and bury them everywhere, but in poor mast years, they eat them.
Yeah.
So that's another element that's going on here where this boom bust cycle is really important
Mm-hmm.
because the oak has to basically kill off all of its seed predators like insects, but it doesn't want to kill off all the squirrels. It's negative to be in that, you know,
Or the blue
that
jays or the crows.
right. It's negative during those years when it's killing off the insects with the interaction with all these other species,
Right.
but it's positive in the boom year where they go cache all the stuff
Mm-hmm.
preferentially, but the insects infestation explodes, right?
Right.
So it's got this weird uh, dynamic that starts to emerge where you have this kind of cycle.
Yeah.
And
That
to
is
me,
so neat.
that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that. And I'm about to start covering hardwood biology and management in my habitat class this fall, and that is
Yeah,
definitely getting added to.
yeah.
I'm gonna definitely talk about that in one of my lectures.
So there's some other cool stuff that's going on. I had one graduate student, Mariah Bogus, that showed one of these elements, but I made a mention earlier that the oak is a foundational genus.
Mm-hmm.
It's structuring the ecosystem, and you can
Right.
kind of get a glimpse of that complexity already. But the interesting thing about it is a lot of the indirect effects that it's having. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not just directly affecting these species with those interactions. It's also by affecting all of those starts to have extended effects in other
Right.
places. And one thing that he showed, we published this a couple of years ago when he was doing the simulated mast stuff. It actually, Dudley Phelps mentioned this work earlier.
Mm-hmm.
In one of the previous
Yeah.
episodes, uh, we when Mariah went out and tried to basically generate a big mast year under trees,
Yeah.
and
So
we
he brought
watched.
acorns in.
Yeah, we brought them and put the
Yeah.
number that it should produce during the banner
Yeah.
year
Sure.
under the tree, and then we had a bunch of things he was measuring. What caught fire and people heard about was the deer response, which was
Right.
delayed, right?
Mm-hmm.
We put them out in November, and the deer response wasn't until months later in January. Even though the acorns were laying around everywhere, they still didn't respond to that. But the cool thing about it was the outcome. He was measuring the plant community responses around the oak, and
Mm-hmm.
because he was concentrating deer activity, especially in that early spring, they were eating a lot of the plants around the tree, and we actually saw this effect of the tree on the local plant community because of increased herbivory, and the more sensitive species to herbivory were more common around the oaks that didn't have mast. So you sort of start to get this spatial heterogeneity in
Mm.
plant community that's being driven by oak masting because it dictates where deer spend their time.
Yeah.
Isn't that neat?
That is super fascinating.
So you got this really cool interaction that's and we could multiply that times a million, right? And that
Yeah.
starts to give you an idea of how complex the system is.
I wonder how much different all this ecology was when the chestnut was still abundant across the landscape.
Oh, man.
Like, how fundamentally did that change the ecology?
I would say it was an enormous effect on the system. It, in so many ways, like it was hard to even predict ways.
Yeah.
But you couple that with the passenger pigeon extinction, and man,
Yeah.
the system is not functioning like
Right.
it did then.
Right. Have we ever talked about that, the passenger pigeon extinction and the effect that that likely had on ecosystems on here?
I'm not sure if we have, but
That's
I talk
something we
about
need to
that
stick in our
regularly.
back pocket.
Yeah,
For
I'm actually fairly well versed on that literature base because I
yeah.
teach about it, and
Right.
there's some pretty interesting things going on there. If
Yeah.
folks want to hear about that, let us know because I can definitely cover a lot of the literature on it real well.
Yeah. I'll give them a little teaser. Like, passenger pigeons may have contributed to the prevalence of early successional cover in some
They
areas.
definitely were. Yeah, there are references to there being feet of poo under their roost sites.
Yeah.
There are references to them blackening out the sun in their migration for
Yeah,
weeks.
and killing trees because after roosting in them, just
Yeah.
from the numbers of birds, they're breaking branches.
Yeah, you're basically punching a hole in the forest everywhere they roost.
Yeah. Anyway, we're kind of
Giving it away now.
going down. Yeah.
There's a lot more to that, though.
I was gonna say we were going down another rabbit trail, but that was more like an alternate flyway or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. So let's see, where are we at here?
So we talked about proximate and ultimate causes of masting.
Yeah. So the other thing that's pretty interesting is you have this local synchrony, but then at larger spatial scales, like if you get to thousands of miles, that starts to break down.
So like regional scale.
Yeah, so regional scale, you have more variation, but through this Moran effect, it actually tends to synchronize it at greater than 1,000-kilometer scales, more than we would expect.
Wow.
It's a really weird thing. So, then you start to have this synchrony at much larger scales than we would expect.
So probably not as closely synchronized at those larger
That's
scales, but there are still some signals of synchrony at those larger scales.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So you made mention earlier. I was trying to collect my thoughts on where I was going with that because we kind of got on a sidebar there, which
It was
I
a
think
fun one though.
Yeah, it was worthwhile. But with the red oak versus
I'm just
white
still
oak.
thinking about squirrels trying to get each other killed. That's hilarious.
Yeah, decreased pilfering. And then one of them tries to steal an acorn and gets killed, and then all of his ones that he worked all fall to bury, then they turn into seedlings. So, did I ever tell you the story about about planting the acorns in the yard? Chitwood and I got really interested in this when at our office we had a window where there were squirrels out there burying acorns, and I just got kind of interested in it. So I started going back and burying an acorn in the same cache after it would get it out.
Yeah.
And those suckers would come back and find them. So then we were like, how do they know where they're at? So we started kind of burying them around in the yard, and they would find all of them.
Mm-hmm.
So
they're sniffing them out, right?
Yeah, that's what we thought. You put an acorn in a pot and wait and see how long. If there's a squirrel around, he's gonna find it fast.
It'd have to be a ways from my house. I got too many dogs running around right now for them to even think
Yeah,
about coming
well,
up
they might
close.
actually bury some in your pot if you have dogs around because it's
Yeah.
risky.
Trying to get somebody killed.
That's how we can guarantee they plant them for us. So there was an interesting study that just came out. And this was this Zemkowiak guy, and they were looking at synchrony across species, and they had Quercus ruba, Quercus alba, and Montana. What is Montana? You know that one right off?
Mm-mm.
That's a red oak, I'm guessing.
I can look it up real quick.
Look that one up real quick. But we've got two red oaks and a white oak, I believe.
That's chestnut oak.
Chestnut
Montana
oak. Okay.
is chestnut oak.
Okay, so we got one red oak and two white oak species. It makes sense why I wouldn't have known because I'm not working in that range right now. So what they were trying to figure out in this study was basically whether or not there was synchrony across these species.
Mm-hmm.
And there did tend to be synchrony. So even
within a subgenus?
No, across.
Across subgenera.
Yeah. I think they had tighter synchrony in the, that's another thing that people may not be picking up on here, but I'll just say explicitly. What synchrony means varies.
Mm-hmm.
Like synchrony could be just does it more than normal, or it could be what I keep kind of giving you a gradient of synchrony where you have highly synchronous, which is the majority of it overlaps.
Yeah.
The white oaks, as far as I understand from this study, they have a high degree of synchrony, but now I'm looking at it. Yeah, I would say that's accurate. There's a high degree of synchrony. So for Charlotte, if you want to put this in on YouTube for those that are watching, this is figure 1 and figure 2. You can kind of see how synchronous the species are, comparing each to each other.
Mm-hmm.
There tends to be a higher degree of synchrony between the two white oak species, but it's still pretty synchronous.
Right.
With the red oak species at the same sites. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And what they're relating it to here is that basically because you have this synchrony even across the oak species for those insects that could utilize multiple species, that is helping with that issue. Right, so like if we have diversity and there's always somebody producing at a high degree in every year, it might sustain this really high acorn weevil population. But this guard's essentially against that. That's what they're saying.
Yeah, I don't know. That's confusing to me, just because I'm thinking, I can't even remember the name of the paper, but we discussed them quite a bit last year when we did the Oaktober series, or we didn't do a whole series, but a couple of episodes. But there are a couple of Southern Appalachian studies that are, one of them in particular was like 20 years. And they had I remember they produced this figure that had histograms across like 5 different species. And it was very clear. This research was done in the early 90s, and it was very clear that all of the species that they measured that were in the red oak genus tended to produce kind of synchronously. And you would see a spike in those on the histogram, but then the next year they would go down, but then the white oak species that they studied would go up. So I guess that's what you were referring to earlier when we were talking about different degrees of synchrony.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think that's that's a good way to explain it. The other thing is they're still arguing. People, we're measuring
like we are about
these
turkeys.
Yeah. Well, you find different things in different areas, and
that's right.
The relative importance of synchrony differs across the range of oaks. So
right.
And it probably is changing depending on the species composition and the age of the forest and all sorts of things. I did see one of the papers showed that the advantages of synchrony increase with age in the oaks.
Yeah, that would make sense.
So, there's so many things. And we kind of had a little sidebar about how complex it is.
Yeah.
But it's so complex it makes sense that if we try to study it in different contexts that we would get different versions of that complexity.
Right. And two, the thing that makes me glad that I'm not an oak researcher is the time scales that some of this stuff happens on is really, really frustrating to probably deal with.
Oh yeah.
And it's so variable.
Yep.
Well, what are the other aspects of kind of the introductory oak biology that you think we should cover before we jump off into other topics in our upcoming episodes?
Well, that's a good question. One thing I did want to talk about the Moran effect because I realized the two conversations that we had about that might have been confusing to some. So I think we need to revisit this idea of a Moran effect. It's pretty interesting, but it's also complex because oaks aren't the only thing that is engaged in mass seeding, right? Where they're trying to synchronize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the one we always think about for sure. But I mean, there's a whole suite of other masting species out there.
Yeah, like the beeches, for example. Mm-hmm. Those are important ones. Some of the Passia genus.
Mm-hmm.
So lots of species are synchronizing seed production across different kinds of spatial scales.
Yeah.
I think that the thing that gets confusing to me is with oaks, we see this high degree of synchrony locally.
Yeah.
Some of that is because the individuals are more related, which there is work from this Bodgkowitz guy showing that more related individuals tend to be more synchronized. So that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But also they're entrained to some weather cue locally.
Right.
Which that's interesting from multiple senses. One, there are lots of species that are entrained on the same weather cue, but when you look at how their synchrony changes over space,
mm-hmm.
they don't do it at the same rate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so there are multiple groups of species that, let's just say rely on precipitation as a cue. But then for some of those species, that synchrony will break down over a smaller spatial scale than for others.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
There's a lot going on here. And if folks really want us to do a deep dive into this, we can go further because we are really just kind of.
Well, they may already consider this a deeper dive than they really ask for.
Like when we've talked about this, even on this episode, like we are diving deeper into this than probably what most people have ever heard already.
Yeah.
But we are still like, we're like on the second layer of the onion.
Yeah.
There's still several more layers in there.
I feel like if we continue this line of inquiry any further, that you're going to end up starting another podcast on oaks. On oaks.
The Mighty Oak podcast. That's probably.
When's the last time you read something about turkeys, Marcus?
Actually yesterday.
Okay.
So, well, I just find it really fascinating. So let's take the beech, for example, and compare that to oaks.
Right.
Oaks, they're both synchronizing on summer temperatures, in part.
Both oaks and beech.
Yes, that's correct. However, the distance, and I'm going to make you do some mental math here. The distance of synchrony with the oaks usually breaks down at about a 400-kilometer resolution.
Oh, boy.
I don't know how many miles that is. I'll
I'm
let
not
you do
doing mental
that
math
math.
today.
That's
That's
like,
about 250 miles.
okay, so that's like the width of Alabama.
Yeah. Here we go.
How many Alabamas is it? I'm never gonna let that go. That's such a good measurement scale. So 400 kilometers, or in Alabama.
Oh, actually, Alabama's about 190 miles wide.
Well, that's close enough.
All right.
So it's conceivable that western Georgia oaks could still be relatively synchronized with eastern Mississippi oaks.
Yeah. Yeah, that would follow.
But if you look at the beaches, the most of the work's been done in European countries on this genus, but they're cued on summer temperatures just like oaks, but their distances are more like 1,500 kilometers. They're remaining synchronous.
9,000 miles. Wait. I added an
No,
extra
that's
zero
wrong.
there. 930 miles.
So the beaches could be synchronized from eastern Georgia to like eastern Texas.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's crazy to me.
it is.
So what's the difference here? So there are a couple of things going on. They're both cued on that, but they're using different cues with respect to each other differently. And one of the papers that I found really interesting is that the beech genus is also keyed in on day length, which doesn't vary that much over larger spatial scales.
Yeah.
And that is helping synchronize it at that larger spatial scale.
So I'm trying to remember the rule right now, and hopefully you can help me out. But I think, isn't it like spring green up, varies by 2 weeks for every 15 degrees in latitude change or something like that?
That sounds right, but I don't remember, honestly.
Okay, I thought it was something like that,
Yeah, that sounds about right.
which is a pretty that's a pretty significant area that would cover.
Yeah,
To only change 2 weeks. So it makes sense
right,
that they would be synchronized at a larger spatial scale than oaks would be.
right. Well, and you look at the range of beaches in Europe, and like that's almost range wide for some of them.
I know, right?
So that's pretty cool. But the whole point of this is, we brought up the Moran effect earlier in the episode, and it may not have been really intuitive to people. And I think part of that's because it's just that itself is a pretty complex topic.
Yeah. So basically, there's this array of masting species. Some of them have, there's some similarities or overlap in the environmental cues that determine when they produce and when they don't, or how they synchronize when they do. And so, because there's variability in the cues that they're responding to, there's differences in how synchronized they are across various geographic distances.
Yes.
Okay. One thing that just popped into my head, and this is something that we didn't prepare for at all, but it's just something that I wonder is given all this and the debate that's going on in the masting literature, have we gotten to the point where we can relatively effectively predict mass crops or forecast mass crops in advance?
That's a good question. Um,
But I guess
I'm
like
trying
if
to
you're
think
thinking
of.
about like if they're queuing on things like summer temperatures, I mean, the forecast would be, you know, not too far in advance of, when they would actually start dropping anyway. So I don't know how useful that would be.
Well, my instinct is that we probably, to some degree, can forecast it, but it probably varies
Yeah.
again
There's going to
based
be
on
just a
which
huge
species and what the cues are.
yeah,
How
just a
predictable
huge
are they?
amount of uncertainty in that forecast. Basically like trying to call like thunder like the summer thunderstorms, coming up with a forecast for those.
Yeah. There has been some work, and I was trying to remember. I've read something about this before, but it's been a minute.
Mm-hmm.
And you know how like I have, we were talking about the spatial decay and synchrony.
Yeah.
Well, the decay in my memory like falls off precipitously after about 1 minute.
This temporal decay.
Yeah. So,
The half-life of your thought is 1 minute.
yeah. But there is a variety of literature, and I thought that I remembered a paper on this, and I actually did remember the name on it somehow. Let me see if I can. I'm gonna say Journe.
Okay.
Journ, and then E with a little tilde over it, whatever that thing's called.
I could buy it.
So this was a paper that was published last year, and it was just a viewpoint on it, but it was the title is Forecasting Seed Production in Perennial Plants, Identifying Challenges and Charting a Path Forward. And I'll just say from my take home message from that is that we probably will be able to forecast mass production for a lot of species fairly well.
Mm-hmm.
The problem that we have right now is the data that we have to train that kind of model is not so good.
Yeah.
Which is, just think about like how well are we tracking acorn production across oak species just in the southeast?
Yeah. I mean, even the states that do it, I mean, it's really, sporadic because they just don't have the time or the manpower to do it.
Yeah. But they in this paper they tested a few models that they like 3 models that they developed, and they were testing it on Vegas, so the beaches.
Yeah.
And they wrote those moderately successful in recreating those seed production dynamics.
I wonder how far out they were forecasting. Do you know?
Well, I think in that case uh, they were actually trying to retrospectively forecast known data.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, and the idea was that if we could take a segment of data and then forecast some known data to develop a model, then we could use that to.
It's like a training data set.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they basically concluded that figuring out some methods to monitor seed production at a large enough scale and spatial and temporal resolution would be really critical for developing a forecasting tool like that.
This is totally off the wall, but did you ever come across anything as to, well, at least the way that I've always perceived it is that beach masting is much more infrequent and unreliable in the southeast as compared to, you go further up into the northeast. You have any idea why that might be? I guess maybe if they're queuing off of summer temperatures, maybe maybe we cross some threshold that negatively affects mass production. Assuming that that's even the case, I've actually never even looked at data to see how much it differs between here and there.
I haven't paid that much attention to the beach masting literature, but I will now.
So I remember I was taught that in a wildlife class that beach mast production was much less reliable in the south as compared to the northeast. But I just kind of, accepted that as fact and moved on, and I've never actually dug into it.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing about black cherry too.
But it did give me an interesting idea that I'm going to explore now. One possibility is that when you get near the edge of the range, synchrony starts to break down.
Well, that would make sense because the whole purpose of synchrony is to ensure reproduction, right?
Yep.
So if you're near the edge of the range, by default, the species probably doesn't perform as well as it does more in the interior of the range. So maybe the environmental characteristics near the edge of the range aren't conducive to supporting that synchrony.
Yep. That I suspect there is data like that, but I have not dug in that literature. But that is exactly the thought process I had on that too.
Well, I just burned my one good thought for the day on that,
Count it,
so
count
I'm done.
it. Yeah. Well,
Well, that's cool stuff regardless.
yeah. It's amazing to me how much work is being done on this, and it makes sense. With oaks and a bunch of these other tree species that are mass seeding. I mean, they're shaping the entire ecosystem.
Mhm.
All these wildlife species, I mean, pathogens in the system, plant communities,
Yeah.
like soil stuff, there are all these different factors that are being affected by mass seeding. So it makes sense that there would be a lot of work on it.
It gets me a little excited when you start talking about that because I think about, all the different it's just I don't know, it's just
The
fascinating
squirrel
all
death match.
yeah, this like the pilfering squirrels, right? I
Yeah,
told Yeah, but I don't know, that stuff's just I guess it's just interesting. It sucks me in
yeah,
because of the
me too.
complexity of it and the interrelationships.
Yeah, one from an intellectual standpoint, as a scientist, that's what gets me excited too, is the complexity and series of interactions between various species. And then I like to try to apply that to things I love, like turkeys.
Yep.
A couple of other things, I guess, that we could touch on before we go. The there's another important part for folks that are interested in species that are eating oaks or acorns. One, the red oak and white oak tend to have a difference in quality,
Mhm.
and that makes sense when you think about the acorn, how long it's taken to develop, and kind of what's it's trying to defend itself from.
Right.
So the red oaks tend to have more tannins in the acorn, which makes sense. It takes a lot longer to develop. It needs to protect itself for longer.
Mhm.
That's something that could be important to wildlife.
Yep.
Although um, we still see really high use of those, particularly late in the season.
Yeah.
And with turkeys, a lot of the red oak species tend to have smaller acorns,
Yep.
but I also said 10 there, like post oak, for example, has small ones that turkeys will gobble down.
Yeah.
But swamp chestnut oak, they're probably not eating a lot of those because they can't
Right.
swallow it.
Yeah. And a lot of the red oak acorns, can still be found in like deer and turkey diets well into spring in
Yeah,
areas that are dominated by, mature hardwood forest.
right. Yeah, and I don't know how consistent the results that we found in Mariah's are across species and systems,
Right.
but I think that's probably a feature of the system. Would be
Mhm.
my guess that red oaks tend to drop during the fall, and they don't get utilized
Yeah.
until late season, in terms of deer season, but on into the spring, as opposed to the white oak that germinates right away. They've got to get on that right away.
Yeah, that's the way that I talk about this, not with just oaks, but I mean even, green forage or seeds that are produced by legumes, for example, all that type of stuff. Just because something is low preference by a species of interest does not mean that it's low value. It's just that it's, not the first thing eaten, and sometimes that's important because you need those reserves in place once the more preferred food items have been exhausted.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So yeah, I think those are interesting tidbits. And if you're a deer hunter, sitting on the white oak while it's dropping is probably a good idea.
I would say.
Whereas you might have a shoe mart oak dropping in November, and it's probably going to have some attraction then, but the attraction to that might be much later in the season.
Man, I've sat that explains, a lot about I mean, I know I've sat many times in the past over red oaks that are just raining and not seen a deer, for a whole sit.
Yeah.
So that explains a lot.
So it's hard to be definitive and give a very specific recommendation that always works. Obviously, the system's too complex.
Yeah.
But if you're starting to understand these principles of what's going on, hopefully that can help you troubleshoot in your situation.
Yeah, well, that was good stuff. Like, I think that ended up, being mostly a synchrony episode, but that was definitely novel, as far as we've never covered it in that level of detail before, and I learned a lot from it. And maybe
I did too.
and maybe that'll help us. We originally had 4 Oaktober episodes planned, but maybe we'll sneak in a 5th bonus one too, since
people are enjoying it.
Yeah, because
I didn't expect for us to get on the.
Well, I didn't either.
The squirrel death games.
No, but that was I was so fascinated by that I couldn't derail that conversation.
Well, and you got to see a little bit of spark, like if that really does not interest you at all and you didn't like listening to it, then being an ecologist, especially a research ecologist, probably not for you.
That's right. And that's okay.
We need all types, right?
Yep.
But that kind of stuff sparks me, and then I get kind of engulfed in it, and I can't help it. But that's why I'm here. That's
the hard thing with this topic, is that there's so much to get into that fascinates you and I, as well as our audience, not just within the context of, hunting and managing turkeys, but also, just like it speaks to all sorts of broader issues too, understand the ecology and the science of it. I mean, there's a whole lot that goes along with that. So
for sure.
Cool stuff.
You know what? We should ask this Botchkowitz guy if he wants to come on for Oaktober.
Yeah. He probably, if you ask him, will go back and listen to this episode and hear you pronounce his name the way you did, decline us.
Well, he may come on just for that, because he needs to correct it. So, all right. Well, that felt like a pretty good overview of why oaks are oaks.
And why they mast when they do, or not.
Yep. And turkeys do eat them.
Indeed.
So we need it. We need there to be a boom and bust, so when there's a boom, they have more to eat.
And if you just so happen to tune into this episode for your first, I guarantee you we talk more about turkeys in most of our episodes.
Well, we didn't call it Turkeytober, although we did miss an opportunity there.
We did.
Yeah, we called it Oaktober, so it makes sense we'd have some, focus on that genus.
And I like to think that maybe we've gotten to the point now where we have some people listening that their sole purpose for doing so isn't just so that they can better manage their turkeys, because I think we've hopefully shared a lot of relevant information on a variety of wildlife management topics. So.
Yeah. Well, and I agree. Hopefully we are cultivating that kind of audience that's curious, and I think for me, I've appreciated more and more that once you start to understand the system, you start to realize how much you don't know about it, but you're also, in learning more about it, start to have more situational awareness, and you're more well equipped to make decisions.
Or as Leopold would put it, you become an intelligent tinkerer.
There you go. I like it.
We should make some stickers with that on them. Intelligent tinkerer. You think people would put those on their cars, or I don't know, they may be afraid of some kind of misinterpretation.
There's no telling what kind of name goes with that.
I don't know. All right.
Thanks everybody for listening. We really appreciate all the feedback. If you hadn't had a chance to rate the podcast, we'd appreciate you helping us out. Share it with your friends and family. And otherwise, stay tuned. We've got more coming on Oaktober. All right.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.